Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Some stories creep into your mind. Others claw their way in and refuse to leave. Brian Asbury's Waking the Dead is here. 8 bone-chilling tales of terror and retribution brought to life by the production team behind Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and the voices of Otis Jiry, Drew Blood, and Geoff Sturtevant. Revenge, violence, a dark humor that cuts deep. From a quadriplegic's horrifying payback to a mother's gruesome fate, Asbury holds nothing back. This is horror that stays with you. Waking the Dead, available now on Amazon and Audible. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and press play.
The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends. It's Sunday night, and you know what that means. It's time to dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for another night of eerie encounters, twisted tales, and stories designed to keep you looking over your shoulder long after the final words are spoken. I'm your host, Otis Jiry. Now, I'm sure everyone has heard the infamous story opening Once Upon a Time. And oh, my friends, those words are a doorway, aren't they? They promise adventure, magic, the impossible. But they also hold something else. Darker things. Hidden things. The parts of fairy tales they stopped telling when you got old enough to understand just how terrifying they really were. Because before they were bedtime stories, they were warnings. Cautionary tales whispered by firelight to keep you from wandering too far. And tonight, we return to those old stories, not as you remember them, but as they were meant to be. Twisted, eerie, and filled with the kind of nightmares that never quite let go. Joining me tonight, as always, is a man who knows a thing or two about a good old-fashioned legend, Malcolm Blackwood. Malcolm, if you had to pick, would you rather follow a trail of breadcrumbs into the woods, open a strange door you've never seen before, or chase a voice calling you from just beyond the water's edge?
Otis, I'm not the kind of man who goes running off into the unknown without asking a few questions first. But if you forced me to pick, I'll take the breadcrumbs. At least then I might have a chance to find my way back.
But that's the trouble, isn't it? Fairy tales always, well, they don't always offer a way back. Some roads lead only forward, some doors only close behind you.
And some choices, once made, can never be undone.
Indeed. Tonight's brand new, never-before-heard stories are all about those choices, where they lead, what they cost, and whether those who make them ever get the chance to regret them. So, get comfortable, but not too comfortable, because in these tales, the wrong step, the wrong word, or the wrong wish just might be your last. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, but want even more, we've got you covered.
By joining our patrons area, you'll unlock the full extended episode, featuring all stories without interruptions, plus access to our entire Simply Scary podcast network archive. All this for just $7.99 per month, or save even more with an annual plan.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and select Patrons in the top menu. You'll be directed to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can start your membership and dive into a world of exclusive horror.
Support indie creators, enjoy ad-free episodes, and double the terror. What could be better? Join us today. Thanks so much for your support. It means the world to us. Our first tale tonight takes us to the edge of the sea, where a singer finds herself drawn to a song that should never be answered. Music has power. It can comfort, it can inspire, and sometimes it can summon. Performed by yours truly, this is The Drowned Chorus by Leyla Eren. Part 1. Eleanor Voss arrived at Blackridge, the coastal town where her family's history ran as deep as the jagged cliffs that framed the shore. The house had been empty for nearly a decade, yet it had been waiting for her. Dust settling in corners, the scent of salt embedded in the wooden beams. Her mother's family had owned the place for generations, but Eleanor had no memories of them. They had all passed before she was old enough to remember. It was the perfect place to practice her craft. She had spent years training her voice, shaping it into something worthy of the stage. But New York had been a waste of time. Her instructors were unimpressed, the opportunities were scarce, and every audition ended in polite rejection. She needed solitude, no distractions, no reminders of her failures. The house sat on the highest ridge overlooking the sea, its back porch opening to a sheer drop of dark stone. Below, waves crashed against the rocks, unrelenting. From the windows, she could see the sea stretching toward the horizon, an expanse of gray under the dimming sky. That first night, she dreamed of drowning. She was deep below the surface, weightless and sinking slowly. She should have been panicked, but there was only quiet. A sound, distant yet distinct, hummed beneath the waves. It wasn't random noise. Not the churn of the tide or the crack of shifting currents. It was melody. Eleanor woke up with the taste of salt on her lips. The town was small and insular. No one seemed particularly eager to welcome her, but she didn't mind. She had never been good at small talk. She made a point to avoid conversation when she went into town for supplies, keeping interactions brief and impersonal. She met Martin Hale during her second visit. He worked at the general store and had been unloading crates of dried goods from a truck when she walked past. He looked about her age, early 30s, maybe a little younger, lean, with dark, wind-tousled hair and a look that suggested he knew every inch of this town. "Moving into the old Voss house?" he asked, resting an arm on the truck bed. She hesitated before nodding. "I used to mow the lawn when I was a kid," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Place always gave me the creeps." Eleanor frowned. "Why?" Martin shrugged. "I don't know. Something about how quiet it was. Felt like someone was always watching from the upstairs window, even when no one was home." She didn't respond. "You a singer?" She stiffened at the question. "Why do you ask?" Martin nodded toward the bag in her hands. vocal exercise books, blank sheet music, and a pack of throat lozenges.
"I guess that's obvious," she muttered. "You hear the stories yet?" "What stories?" His expression darkened slightly. "The ones about the water. The old fishermen talk about the drowned chorus." She let out a dry laugh. "That's supposed to scare me?" "Probably not," he admitted, "but I wouldn't go singing too close to the cliffs if I were you." She rolled her eyes and left without another word. The house absorbed sound. She could tell the moment she started singing. The acoustics were incredible. The high ceilings, the thick wood absorbing nothing, allowing her voice to carry. She sang arias that had once been beyond her range, feeling her voice resonate in her chest. She was so absorbed in her performance, in fact, that she barely noticed when the sun started dipping below the horizon. The first time she heard the voice, she thought it was her own echo. She had been running scales, pushing her range, when she hit a high note and held it. It rang through the house, clear and unwavering. But just as she drew breath to continue, she heard it, a faint, harmonic tone beneath her own. She stopped and was met with silence. Had she imagined it? Eleanor walked to the back door, stepping onto the porch. The night air was cool, the sea restless beneath her. She inhaled and sang again. The notes soared, pure and strong. This time, it answered, a harmony, delicate, layered beneath her own sound, as if something beneath the waves was singing with her. She backed away from the railing and slammed the door shut. The house swallowed the sound. She stood in the quiet for a long while, pondering what was happening. Eleanor stopped singing. For 2 nights straight, she resisted the urge to test whether she had imagined the strange harmony. She went about her routine, forcing herself to ignore the way her mind kept circling back to the sound, but the silence was unbearable. On the 3rd night, she gave in. She went to the cliffs just before dusk, when the tide was low and the air smelled of brine and wet stone. The wind carried the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sky darkening at the edges. Eleanor inhaled, and softly, tentatively, she sang a simple melody. The response came almost immediately. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't something logical or explainable. The voice beneath the waves was real. It followed her melody, weaving seamlessly through her notes like a thread through fabric. The harmony was delicate and inhumanly perfect. She heard no breath breaks and identified no flaws. She staggered back, and the song stopped with her. The ocean remained restless, indifferent to her terror. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time Eleanor closed her eyes, she felt the pull of the water. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, somewhere between longing and recognition. The next morning, she found wet footprints leading from her front door to the foot of the stairs. Her stomach tightened. She checked the locks, deadbolted. There were no signs of forced entry. In fact, there were no signs of anything at all, except for the water soaking into the wood. She didn't tell Martin. The changes began subtly. Her voice grew stronger, unnaturally so. She could sing for hours without strain, her range expanding beyond anything she had been capable of before. The resonance in her chest was sharper, fuller, and it wasn't just her voice. She no longer felt winded after long walks into town. She barely needed to eat. Her body felt weightless and fluid, as if something inside her had shifted in a way she couldn't quite define. She started avoiding mirrors. Her reflection felt wrong. Her eyes looked darker, the irises too deep, and the pupils were slow to contract in the light. Some nights, she thought she saw movement in them, like the shimmer of water over glass. She began to hum absent-mindedly while cooking, reading, or staring out the window. The harmonies always followed, a whisper just beneath her own voice. She stopped questioning whether the presence was real. It had become undeniable, and it had already settled inside her. Martin showed up unannounced one afternoon, knocking loudly, his stance wary. Eleanor hesitated before opening the door. "You look different," he said after a long moment. She forced a smile. "Bad?" "No, just pale, like you've been sick." He glanced past her into the dim house. "How have you been sleeping?" "Fine," she lied. Martin's expression tightened. "Eleanor, have you been hearing anything out here?" She stiffened. "Like what?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "A few people in town swear they heard something the last few nights. Some kind of singing out by the cliffs." "Maybe someone else moved in nearby," she said. Martin shook his head. "Nobody's moved out here in years." They stood in tense silence. Then he sighed. "Look, just stay away from the water at night, all right?" Eleanor swallowed, nodding. Martin lingered for another second before turning and walking back toward his truck. She waited until he was out of sight before shutting the door. She had no intention of staying away. Part 2. The next time Eleanor stood at the cliffs, she didn't hesitate. She sang, and this time the voice did not merely follow, it led. It was no longer content to be an echo. It wove its own melody around hers, an intricate harmony of impossible precision. The longer she sang, the more she understood it, though she could not say how. There were no words, only tone, only sound. But there was meaning in the way the notes curled around each other, something ancient and knowing. The voice belonged to something waiting beneath the waves. She didn't stop singing, not even when her vision blurred at the edges, not when her skin tingled with an unfamiliar electricity, not even when the wind shifted and the waves grew still, as if the ocean itself was listening. By the time she turned away, her lips were numb. Eleanor woke in bed, unable to recall how she'd gotten there. Her sheets were damp. She sat up slowly, staring at her hands. Her fingertips were pruned, as if she had been in the water for hours. She pulled herself out of bed, walking unsteadily to the bathroom. The mirror confirmed what she had been afraid to acknowledge. She barely recognized her own face. Her skin had lost its warmth, paling to something just shy of unnatural. Her eyes were darker still, the whites tinged faintly gray. But worst of all was her mouth. Her lips were colorless, the corners stretched slightly too wide, as if her face was still shifting, still finding its final shape. She gripped the sink, swallowing back nausea. The house was silent, but she felt it. Something coiled in the walls just beyond hearing. She had invited it in. She didn't go into town. She didn't leave the house at all. Her reflection became something to avoid entirely. Every time she passed a mirror, the urge to look too long gnawed at her, as if some part of her was waiting to catch her own gaze, to see something that shouldn't be there. Instead, she sang. She did not decide to, she simply did, humming under her breath, whispering melodies to the air, feeling the way the harmonies responded, like a second voice trapped beneath her ribs. It didn't matter that she seemed to be alone. She wasn't. Martin showed up again, pounding on the door with more force than before. Eleanor hesitated before answering. His expression darkened the moment he saw her. "Jesus, Eleanor, what the hell's going on?" "I don't know what you mean." "You don't?" His voice was sharp and unsteady. "Because people have been hearing you at night, and I don't mean just around here. I mean out in the harbor, miles offshore." Eleanor said nothing. Martin's jaw tensed. "What are you doing?" The question sent something crawling under her skin. What was she doing? She had barely thought about it. She should have been afraid, but all she felt was irritation, an unwanted interruption, something pulling her from where she belonged. Martin stared at her, waiting. When she didn't respond, he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Eleanor, I know you feel it." Something in her stomach twisted violently. Feel what? His hands curled into fists at his sides. The pull. She inhaled sharply. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know what happened to your mother." There was silence then, a deep, aching silence. Eleanor's mouth went dry. "My mother?" "Vanished," Martin said. "Same way you're about to." Eleanor had never met her mother. She had never known anything about her, only that she had died young. That was what she had always been told. Now, the lie was unraveling. Martin exhaled, stepping back. His voice softened. "I've seen this before. I've heard it before. You have to fight it, Eleanor." She could barely process the words. She had never had a choice. The door shut in his face before she even realized she had moved. Eleanor barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the waves below. They were speaking to her now, even without song. She could hear them in a way she had never been able to before. Not just the crash of water against stone, but the movement beneath. The ocean had a voice. It had always had a voice. She had just never been listening properly. She left the house at dusk. Martin had tried to warn her, but the words had unraveled in her head like fraying thread. He didn't understand. Her mother had been part of this too. Whatever happened to her, whatever she became, had begun long before she was born. She had never belonged on land. Eleanor reached the cliffs, stepping closer to the edge than she ever had before. The wind pressed against her back, urging her forward. She opened her mouth, and the song came without effort. It was not the delicate melodies she had practiced for years, nor the carefully honed technique drilled into her by instructors who had never heard something like this. This was not human. The response came instantly. The ocean answered in full force, harmonizing with her voice, lifting it higher. The water below churned, shapes rippling beneath the surface. She felt the change as she sang. Her feet numbed where they touched the ground. Her spine lengthened, her skin tingling as though her body was realigning itself. She wasn't afraid. Quite the contrary. She had never felt so right. Just then, a hand seized her wrist, yanking her back so hard she nearly collapsed, and the song snapped, severed mid-note. Eleanor turned sharply, disoriented, her vision blurred from the sudden break in connection. Martin was there, furious and terrified. "You were about to jump," he snapped. She blinked slowly, as if the words didn't quite register. "No, Martin's grip tightened. "Yes, Eleanor, you were." Something between them cracked. The wind died, and the ocean went still. Eleanor's chest ached at the loss of sound, at the emptiness that filled the air without it. She hadn't been about to jump. She had simply been going where she was meant to go. Martin stared at her. Her face was tight, his jaw locked, but there was something else in his expression, something closer to grief. "I can help you," he said quietly. Eleanor swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him that was impossible, but she didn't. Instead, she let him pull her away from the cliffs. The ocean did not fight him. Not yet. Part 3. Martin didn't let go of Eleanor's wrist until they were inside her house, with the door shut behind them. He stood between her and the exit, breathing hard. His clothes were damp from the ocean spray, his jaw clenched so tightly she could hear his teeth grind. Eleanor didn't move. She felt hollow, like something had been scooped out of her chest the moment she had been pulled from the cliffside. The house felt dead, devoid of sound. She had lost the song. "I need to show you something," Martin said. He stepped away from the door and grabbed a chair, dragging it toward the old bookcase that had stood untouched since she moved in. He climbed up, reaching for something behind the top row of books. When he came down, he held a wooden box that Eleanor had never seen before. "Your mother left this," Martin said, "before disappearing." "How do you know that?" Eleanor asked. Martin exhaled sharply. "Because my mom saw her leave it." Eleanor sat down without thinking. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box, the wood cool beneath her fingers. It wasn't locked. The latch lifted with an unsettling ease, as if it had been waiting. Inside was a photograph. Eleanor recognized the woman immediately. Her mother. She had never seen a picture of her before, but she knew. The woman in the photo stood on the cliffs, her hair tangled by the wind, the ocean stretched behind her. She was beautiful, haunting. Her eyes were the same as Eleanor's, but that wasn't what shocked her the most. Rather, it was the second figure in the photo. Standing at the water's edge was a woman, or something like one. Her face was pale, her limbs elongated. Her hair slicked against her skull as if she had just emerged from the depths. Her mouth was slightly open, and her lips stretched too wide. Eleanor knew her, too. She had seen her in the water. "Do you get it now?" Martin asked softly. Eleanor's throat tightened. "I don't." Martin's expression darkened. "You do." She didn't sleep. The box sat on the table, the photograph staring at her no matter how many times she turned it over. She could hear the ocean again, not just in the distance, not muffled by walls or glass. It was inside her, calling. She curled in on herself, hands tangled in her hair, trying to drown it out. But there was no drowning something that had already claimed her. The storm rolled in just before dawn. Eleanor woke to the sound of rain hammering against the windows, thunder shuddering through the house. The ocean was alive with movement, the wind screaming through the cliffs. She didn't think, she simply moved. Barefoot, she stepped out onto the porch, her thin nightgown clinging to her skin. The rain soaked her instantly, but she barely felt it. She walked down the narrow path and across the wet grass to the edge of the cliffs, and there they were, black-eyed figures emerging from the water, too many to count. Their bodies shimmered under the storm-lit sky, too long, too smooth, too wrong. Their hair floated weightlessly despite the wind. They sang. The sound was beautiful. The sound was beautiful. Perfect. Eleanor parted her lips and answered. Martin reached the cliffs too late. The storm had torn through Blackridge with a violence he hadn't seen in years, the wind howling through the trees, the ocean frothing beneath the lightning-lit sky. He had known, somewhere deep in his gut, that Eleanor would be out there. But by the time he arrived, she was already standing at the edge, her nightgown clinging to a rain-soaked frame, her bare feet inches from the drop. The ocean below was writhing, filled with shapes undulating just beneath the surface, too fluid to be human, yet too familiar to be mistaken for anything else. Martin could hear the song, even through the storm's relentless din. It wasn't natural. The melody curled through the wind, layered in impossible harmonies. It vibrated in his bones, pulling at something buried deep in his mind, a feeling like nostalgia. Like he was hearing something he had always known but had long since forgotten. And Eleanor was singing with them, except her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was something beyond human, woven into the tide that had never belonged to land. Martin ran. "Eleanor!" he shouted. She didn't flinch or turn, didn't stop. Instead, she stepped forward. Martin lunged, catching her wrist just as she tipped over the edge, and she screamed, not in fear, but in agony. Her body convulsed, writhing in his grip. Her skin was like ice beneath his fingers, but worse than that, it was changing. Before his very eyes, she was shifting, coming undone. Beneath the wet fabric of her gown, her limbs elongated, her spine arching in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Her eyes snapped open, black, endless, and consuming. And yet Martin held on. The ocean surged, the figures reaching for her. And Eleanor reached back. Her fingers wrapped around Martin's wrist, but she wasn't pulling away. She was pulling him with her. Martin braced his feet against the slick grass, fighting to stay grounded. "Eleanor!" Her mouth opened, and in that moment, he caught a glimpse of her teeth, sharpened into delicate points, and of her lips stretched far too wide. She was almost gone. He was running out of time. Something flickered behind Eleanor's gaze as Martin watched, something human and terrified. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. Martin yanked, and with all his strength, he pulled her backward, ripping her from the song, from the voices, from the arms waiting in the water. She collapsed against him, sobbing as the ocean roared in protest. The figures reeled back, their song fracturing. The wind howled through the cliffs, the waves crashing against the rocks with violent force. And then, silence. The storm broke, the wind died, and the ocean stilled. The figures vanished. Eleanor didn't speak for days. Martin stayed. He didn't leave the house or let her out of his sight. The ocean was quiet for now, but they both suspected it wasn't over. It had let her go this time, but the song had already been sung, and one day it would call again. Eleanor departed Blackridge before the first frost without saying goodbye to Martin. She didn't see the point. In her mind, there was nothing left to say. The town had already decided what had happened. The storm, the madness, the way she had nearly thrown herself into the ocean. They didn't ask questions, nor did they desire answers. And Eleanor had no intention of providing them. She moved inland, far from the coast and tides. Despite her efforts, however, the ocean never truly left her. She still heard the song in her sleep, still woke with her mouth half open, mid-note, as if she had been singing in her dreams. She caught herself humming melodies that weren't hers at odd hours, producing harmonies that had no place in the world of men. Her reflection, still wasn't right. The irises of her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, something too dark and deep, as if she could see past the glass, beyond the surface, into something waiting on the other side. She did what she had to salvage her sanity. She stopped looking. The first time she heard it again, she was standing in the middle of a crowded street. Traffic rumbled around her, engines coughing, voices rising in a dull roar. People pressed in from all sides. The noise should have drowned everything else out, but it didn't. The song came calling anyway, soft, gentle, and distant. Her hands clenched into fists, turned away from the sound, and continued on her way, doing her best to put it behind her. But no matter what she did, and no matter the distance she put between herself and the sea, she felt it waiting. One day, she knew, the ocean would find her again. And when it did, she wouldn't be able to walk away. And that was The Drowned Chorus by Leyla Eren, as performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. You know, Otis, I think I'll be keeping my singing to the shower from now on. No harmonizing with unseen voices for me.
There's something about the ocean, isn't there? Calls, it tempts, but it never quite gives anything back for free.
That's the thing about old stories. When the sea makes you an offer, it's never just a gift. It's a trade.
Our next tale comes from a name some of you may already know, Jasper DeWitt. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Jasper is the author of The Patient That Nearly Drove Me Out of Medicine, one of the most infamous horror stories to come out of Reddit's nosleep forum.
That's right. If you haven't read it, you might have seen it in the bookstore under the title The Patient, available now on Amazon. And if you still haven't heard of it, just wait. Ryan Reynolds' production company is adapting it into a feature film.
Now, that's what I call a modern legend. But tonight, we're not here to talk about medicine. We're here to talk about another kind of story. One that takes us to a world just beyond the one we know, where childhood adventures may not be as innocent as they seem. Performed by yours truly, this is Straight On Till Mourning by Jasper DeWitt. Flora Sampson still wasn't sure what she was doing here. Come to that, she wasn't sure if she'd lost her mind. Most people she'd spoken to certainly thought she had. Though, to be fair, that was nothing new. The idea of a lady writer, let alone a reporter, was something people still couldn't quite seem to get their heads around. Her poor dear mother certainly couldn't. A reporter indeed, the old battle axe had said more times than she could count. Really, Flora, what man of quality is going to want to marry a woman who tramps around in dark corners getting soot on her petticoats? Absurd. Absurd, Flora thought, as she stretched her legs in the handsome captain's chair, emblazoned with the Eton College crest. Yes, Mother, absurd is right. If you only knew how much, you might die of shame. But Flora did know. It was only the fact that she would die of curiosity before she died of shame that had brought her here. Because when you got right down to it, the reason for her visit to Eton College now, in the spring of 1930, was truly absurd. It was only her inveterate capacity to follow a hunch which told her it might be true, and that might just be madness superseding whatever genius she possessed as an investigator. To even voice the hypothesis which had brought her to the door of Master James Hawkins, Eton's new teacher of religion, would be enough to make anyone else break out in peals of derisive laughter. To most people, That'd be the end of it. But to Florida, that just made it more fun. Though, of course, she wasn't stupid. She knew that if what she suspected were even conceivable, she'd need evidence that would break through not just the disbelief of her colleagues, but the shell of an identity Hawkins himself had constructed. And so, she had dug and dug before the meeting, trying desperately to validate any piece the teacher's scrupulously vague background she could snatch. And it was only when she discovered that most of it either couldn't be proven or flatly contradicted public record that she began to think she had her man, which had brought her inexorably here to a meeting with Hawkins himself and the exposure of what might be the greatest historical cover-up, as well as the most cast-iron proof of supernatural elements beyond man's comprehension, ever conceived, if she could only get him to admit it. "Miss Sampson," the secretary's polite, crisp voice jarred Flora out of her thoughts. She looked up. Yes? Master Hawkins will see you now." Anxiety pooled in Flora's stomach, but she only nodded crisply. "Well, thank you." She stood up and, as the secretary pulled the door wide, walked into the lion's den itself. A first look around the room made excitement blossom in her chest, because if any teacher's apartments could have confirmed her suspicions, it was this one. It was nothing like the staid quarters kept by other Eton masters. Maps littered the walls, a perfectly constructed ship in a bottle reclined across the desk. Endless yellowing copies of the Eton Chronicle sprawled on the floor, and to crown all, over the mantelpiece, there hung a rusty, visibly dulled cutlass. However, there was no sign of the master himself. No sign at all. "Miss Sampson?" Flora jumped at the smooth, aristocratic purr behind her and turned to find Hawkins himself standing behind the open door, which he slid closed with a casual smirk. The sight of him made butterflies rise in her stomach, and not entirely from nerves. He was a true specimen of a man, with long, dark, untamed hair, a wiry, muscled body, which seemed to cling to the inside of his staid master's dress, and a face that might as well have been chiseled from marble, so distinct and graceful were the line of his cheekbones and the cleft of his chin. A pair of glittering, forget-me-not blue eyes regarded her with supercilious pleasure. Only two imperfections marred his stunning good looks: his skin, which carried the distinct yellow of fading parchment, giving him the appearance of a man who'd not been so much well-preserved as mummified, and the obviously false wooden hand which sat at his side. Yet, striking though he was physically, what was far more exciting to Flora was not one detail of his appearance argued in any way against what she suspected. She held out her hand. "Master Hawkins, a pleasure to meet you." Instead of simply taking her hand, Hawkins bent at the waist and kissed it with roguish savoir-faire. "Likewise, I'm sure." He straightened, slouched around his desk, and sat down. "Now, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" Flora swallowed and sat down opposite him. "Master Hawkins, I'm afraid you'll think me quite mad." Hawkins' eyes glittered. "Mad? Oh, Miss Sampson, I doubt that. You're far too young. Madness is, after all, what did Shakespeare say? Ah, yes, second childlessness and mere oblivion, the prelude to death. And you, Miss Sampson, look very much alive." He winked, and Flora felt color rise in her cheeks. "In that case, Master Hawkins, perhaps you'll entertain a few questions." "Naturally. Anything for an intrepid member of the press, particularly one so," his eyes flicked to her dress for a second, "unconventional, though I fail to see why you should be interested in me. Well, you've cut quite a figure since arriving at Eton." I suppose. There's quite a lot of local gossip about you. A glittering smile. Nothing good, I hope. I think we both know the answer to that. Hawkins leaned back and sighed. I know what people say, particularly my colleagues. Rather boggles their mind that someone like me, someone without what they think as good form, would be teaching at a place like this. I suppose it was inevitable that someone like you would come knocking eventually. Master Hawkins, with respect, it's not simply complaints about form that have me here. If I investigated every teacher with new ideas, I'd never get anything done. Then why me? Flora drew a sharp breath. Well, your background, for one. Or should I say, your lack of a background. My background? Heavens, Miss Sampson, you could have asked anyone about that. I'm not so different from any other teacher here, really. Just an old alum trying to give back to the institution which gave him the best years of his life. Well, yes, about that. Flora pulled out her notes. I've been through every edition of the Eton Chronicle and class notes for the past 30 years. There's no James Hawkins mentioned anywhere. Hawkins raised a hand to his breast in mock shock. Are you accusing me of lying about my attendance, Miss Sampson? No, I've spoken to the other teachers. They say you know things no one but an old Etonian would know. And not just an old Etonian either. A pop. It's obvious you went here. Then what are you suggesting? That I've taken this post under a pseudonym? Well, yes, exactly. And forgive me, Miss Sampson, but why should I do that? This was it. The moment when she had to either abandon her entire theory or risk seeming insane, and she knew what she had to do. She smirked back at him knowingly. You tell me, Captain. Thank God she hadn't blinked when she said, because in only one tiny infinitesimal fraction of a second, something like dread flashed in Hawkins' eyes. Then, like nothing, it was gone. He laughed. Captain, I have no idea what you mean, Miss Hawkins. I come from thoroughly landlocked stock, I assure you. I didn't say you were a naval captain. Flora's smirk deepened. You got there on your own. Well, it's a natural assumption. I suppose you must have seen all my decorations and assumed I had some unspoken maritime past. I think you do. For God's sakes, doing what? Piracy. Piracy? Yes, piracy. Flora reached into her handbag and extracted something. A visibly aged copy of the Eton Chronicle. You see, Master Hawkins, I didn't just go back through 30 years of records here. I actually went back almost 100. And do you know what I found? Do keep me in suspense, I beg you. That beginning in 1853, this school has no record of its pupils. None at all. Pages listing them have all been ripped out. Why do you suppose that is? Well, I'm sure I don't know. Yes, you do. Because you removed them. Me? Yes, you. And also, I even had a telephone call with the headmaster some weeks ago. He would only say you came highly recommended. I don't see what crime that is. Highly recommended. By a Mr. J.M. Barry. Hawkins stared at her. Miss Sampson, I'm afraid I am really confused. Are you suggesting that a man of my youth and vigor is actually nearly a century old, not to mention none other than the real living embodiment of some story by the estimable Mr. Barry? Flora smiled. Yes, Jazz, Hook, Captain, that is precisely what I'm suggesting. You can call me mad if you like, everyone else has. But I think we both know I'm right. But don't worry, I'm not here to expose you. Oh, well, that's a relief, Hawkins said with a roll of his eyes. though Flora could tell there was something slightly intrigued in his face. Slowly he regarded her, his eyes narrowing in scrutiny before speaking. Well, all right, I'll play along. Supposing I was who you say I am, Miss Sampson, despite the fact that even in Mr. Barry's play, Captain Hook is dead. Supposing I was him. Tell me this. Why should an infamous blackguard of the Spanish Main, the captain of the Jolly Roger, a fiend so infamous that to even speak his real name would be to set the country ablaze, why should he be willing to trust you? Because I don't believe Mr. Barry. No, there are two sides to every story, Captain. And frankly, if your cover story has holes in it, then Mr. Barry's play is practically littered with them. Well, for instance, Neverland is supposed to be a place without grown-ups, for one. So how did a crew of grown pirates get there? How did a tribe of Indians get there? And why, when there are untold treasures, should they, let alone their desperate and dangerous captain, all fixate on one small boy? Has it occurred to you that it's only a story for children? Hawkins asked. That you might simply be driving yourself mad looking for logic in fairy tales? Flora chuckled. Captain, I don't believe in fairies. The effect this simple sentence wrought on James Hawkins was incredible. As soon as she said it, a smile of utter savage relief floated across his face, and he leaned in across the desk. Ah, and now you have my attention, Miss Sampson. Cold triumph flashed in his eyes. Good. Go on not believing in fairies. If you can, make sure no one does. Because every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, the triumph gave way to dark rumination. One of those things falls down dead. And Flora felt her breath catch as the mask of James Hawkins melted away, and Captain Jazz Hook of the Jolly Roger, cadaverous, black-avised, and yet beautiful, met her eyes. What happened to you, Captain? She asked. What really happened to you? Hook only smiled and stared down at his wooden hand. Let me tell you something first, Miss Sampson, just for my curiosity. Yes? His eyes lit with flickering, half-forgotten fire, like the spark in a long, disused kerosene lamp. What gave me away? Flora grinned. Mr. Barry's speech about you a few years ago. Hook at Eton. It sounded detailed enough that he got it straight from the source. After that, finding the years with the records ripped out confirmed it. Not to mention the name. Jim Hawkins. From Treasure Island? Hook chuckled. Another work on which I'm happy to have been a source. You barbecue in Flint personally, you know. Not sure they ever feared me, whatever Mr. Barry says, but I did know them before the other things happened. And what other things are those? Slowly, Captain James Hook sighed and began to finally tell his true, incredible story. Let us be clear about something before I proceed. Mr. Barry is not wholly to blame for his rendering of my story. A playwright's not a journalist, and though he has taken liberties which excise the story's true moral, nonetheless, he has been kind to me. A share of the proceeds from his version have been mine since it first premiered on the London stage, not to mention he helped me win for the modest scholar's life which I now possess. A man who knows what it is to be deprived of the milk of human kindness as painfully as I do cannot be too choosy about such mercies when he finds them. Whatever his failures as an artist, Jim Barry gave me a life worth living, and that's an end to it. He sighed, and in that instant, it seemed that every instant of the century he had lived appeared on his face. However, while I cannot reprove him personally, neither can I approve of his play or his novel. Both are dangerous, more dangerous than they should be. And all because of that infernal section when his fairy dies. I begged and pleaded with Jim to take it out. But the man has a bit of a pirate in him, and like all playwrights, he simply cannot bear to grudge his audience an opportunity for applause. Were the play only viewed by adults, this would do no harm, but its popularity among children is a great concern to me, because I know all too well what children clapping for such creatures can produce. But that's a matter for later. You're here for me, after all, not my complaints, and I'll grant you I'm an interesting subject. A man whose true identity would set the country ablaze, Jim calls me, and perhaps he's right. Unfortunately, even I have only the vaguest clues. More than a few have remarked, for example, upon my resemblance to the late Queen Victoria, or to the manner in which my curiously yellow blood was also noted as a feature of a certain lord who fell out of favor with Her Majesty shortly after my birth. Even my true surname, Gordon, holds no answers, for the last man who held it died long before my birth. All I know is that whoever I am, I must be somebody, because only somebody would be raised, as I was, in a secluded manor house with a rotating army of nannies, masters, and servants to look after my every need. Well, perhaps not my every need. They did leave out one, the need to be loved. And perhaps that was the beginning of all my woes. From there followed my time at Eton, the happiest days of my life, as you already know from Mr. Barry's account, and thereafter my premature departure from Balliol College. About that too. There's not much to say, save that I soon determined upon my arrival that the academic life held no true interest for me. The irony of my current post is not lost on me, I assure you. But no, what curiosity I had was reserved for things which could not be learned in books. Not to mention, I knew that, given the unanswerable issue of my birth, my career in respectable society would always be one which took place, as it were, in a terrarium, for there was an invisible and yet immovable ceiling on what I could accomplish. Whereas life outside polite society, in the bellum omnium contra omnes, with its ruthless hierarchy of strength, there I might find my place without impediment. Which is why, as soon as I caught wind that a naval ship bound for the Spanish Main was docked in a nearby harbor, I immediately volunteered my services. I did not stay on that ship long, though. Only long enough to learn the most basic aspects of sea life, and to gain for myself such calluses and bruises as would compensate for my irretrievably Etonian accent. I'm afraid that my seamates also thought me quite useless at first, and made no secret of their opinion. Indeed, they often expressed it in the cruelest of ways, which is why, by the time our ship was eventually attacked by pirates, had no scruples left for their lives. My training under Eton's fencing master made quick work of my former tormentors, and indeed even some of the officers were no match for me. Only their captain, himself an old Estonian, proved to be too skilled, yet by the time he disarmed me, it was too late. The pirates had taken most of the ship. He went down fighting, but he went down all the same. Which was, of course, right when the pirates themselves noticed that I wasn't one of theirs, that, in fact, I wore the uniform of the enemy. One of the stupider ones tried to kill me, thinking I'd only turned on my comrades because I was crazed. But I dispatched them with barely a thought. Which is when their captain finally took notice and called for them to leave off. He approached me and called for parley. I agreed. Then he asked what I wanted, so I told him. I wanted to join him. The man laughed at that. You, he asked. Some toff's bastard that's barely more than a lubber? Aye, I said. Thou'rt a fool. A fool who cut down your men. I raised my saber. But very well. Try me yourself if you wish. If you kill me, you're short an enemy. If you don't, you'll take me with you." The grizzled old scoundrel looked very surprised at that, yet, for all that, he drew his cutlass and did as I suggested. His first few strikes were easy to avoid, barely more than idle pokes. Yet after some minutes, when he saw I was no green swordsman, he did eventually put up a fight. And what he lacked in technique, let me tell you, he more than made up in ferocity and long practice. I only barely managed to slice his arm before he disarmed me. But I was not done. As he tried to close with me, my boxer's instincts took over, and I threw a fierce left hook, knocking him backwards. A frightful look came into his eyes at that, and he strode toward me, saber held high, as if he meant to kill me, before dropping the sword and embracing me like a brother. "By thunder, green as thou lookest, thou'rt a demon," he laughed. "What be thy name, me hearty?" "James Gordon." "James Gordon? Ha!" he spat. "A pox on that. Thou'st knocked one of my teeth loose, lad. You see that?" He raised his mouth, lip to expose the spot where one of his blackened teeth had fallen out from my blow. I could only grin. "Your bloody fault for getting on the wrong end of my left hook." The captain began to laugh and seized my left hand, clasping it in his own. "Aye, and that shall be thy name from hence," he shouted. "James Hook, our new shipmate aboard the Jolly Roger." A roar went up from the men, and from then on, I was indeed one of them. I sailed with them for decades after that and served many duties, though my first and most important was training the men to fight as I did. And that dear old captain, Red Hand, as I learned he was called, treated me less like a shipmate and more like a son. He would train me to fight with a pirate's cruelty every night when he got the chance, and by the time he died of a pox caught off some whore in Tortuga, the men chose me unanimously to succeed him, which is how the reign of Captain Hook truly began. Hawkins paused and looked up at Flora with a sad expression. "Now, I don't suppose you can understand this, Miss Sampson, never having been a pirate yourself, but the bond between shipmates engaged in that peculiar enterprise is not one of friendship. It transcends that. It's more like a brotherhood, in the truest sense of the word. You may not like your shipmates all the time, you may not even trust them, but you love them, and even more so as a captain. There wasn't a man on the Jolly Roger I'd not have died for and considered it fair wages. It is essential that you understand this, if the rest of my story is to make any sense at all." Flora nodded. "I understand." "Very well. Then to the point. As you already know, the name of Captain Hook spread far and wide. There are many in Her Majesty's Navy, or among the Spanish, or even among those who wanted the gold from one of those two countries, who would have happily seen me hanged, and if not hanged, then at least dead. I was more than infamous, Miss Sampson. I was wanted, dead or alive, and by extension, so were my crew, which is how the whole episode began. The Spanish captured one of my men. They obtained, by torture, the knowledge of my movements and sent their fleet to sink me. To be honest, I wish they'd managed it. It would have made everything to come so much simpler. But alas, they did not have the mercy for that. No. Instead, once they had boarded and slaughtered their way through most of my crew, they made me watch as they butchered the rest before breaking my ship's wheel and leaving me drifting into open water. They laughed as they tied me to the mast. "El Capitan se hunde con el barco," they taunted. And even not speaking much of their tongue, I knew what it meant. The captain goes down with the ship. For days and nights after that, I floated in agony, helplessly praying for the sun or my own starvation, or even for the waves to kill me just so it could all end. You cannot imagine it. In the words of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. You do know your Coleridge, don't you, Miss Sampson? Flora nodded, and Hawkins' already bitter expression grew haunted. Good. Because once you've finished with me, that might be another little errand for your peculiar brand of investigative genius. Knowing what I now know, I cannot help thinking that Coleridge's Ancient Mariner must have also been a real person. An unlikely muse for Coleridge, just as I've been for Mr. Barry. And oh, what I would have given to meet him, to talk to him, to tell him he's not alone in holding those dreadful memories, nor in being cursed to hold them for an unbounded eternity. I think he and I alone, among the human race, can know what truly lurks on the dreadful frontier of open water. It was on my third day of restless tossing that it appeared. That dreadful sail. That monstrous ship. And oh, horror. The 2 passengers who crewed it, playing dice for my soul. Death and, oh God. For this reason alone, I know Coleridge knew whereof he spoke. What is it he says? Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare, life and death, was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. Yes. Death's companion certainly answered to that description. Yet unlike the Ancient Mariner, who became her prey solely thanks to her skill at the dice, Miss Sampson, I was infinitely more foolish. For you see, she lost the game for my soul. I would have died had not I, in my foolish terror of death and recognition of his fearful companion, cried out to her. Wait, I rasped, through parched lips and a ruined throat. Parley? The ship stopped, and life and death turned her eyes upon me, curious. I pressed my advantage. Take me, I cried. If you will only give me back my crew and my ship, then I will endure life and death willingly. Please, restore what I have lost and I am yours. There was a moment's pause, as if all existence had held its breath, and then, oh God, the fiend, the monstrous life and death herself, began to cackle and caper before me. The game is done, she cried, in a voice that was that much more monstrous because its unearthly echo was tinged with a girlish glee. I've won! And this, Miss Sampson, is when the nightmare which Mr. Barry renders as a children's story truly begins. For that very moment she reached up to her hair and shook it. Only it was not hair. No, those golden locks were mere illusions which the human mind concocts in order to hide what it dare not face. For every strand of that shimmering golden sunbeam hair was naught but endless atoms of light falling down her shoulders like endless pouring grains of sand. No, not sand. Dust. For you see, it was not the head of life and death that those rays of light cascaded from, but rather what nested atop her head. And what was that? Nothing but thousands of small scarab-like forms with golden wings. And it was these which, in shaking her head, she dislodged, revealing the gnarled, mangled miniature parodies on the human form beneath their wings. They swarmed the ship. They swarmed me, as millions of radiant dust motes fell from their shapes. And I, still tied to the mast, was obliged to spend hours that felt like years, screaming as they ate their way through the flesh of my now forever undying and cursedly immortal body. I was not even allowed to pass out, but only scream in endless, peeling, parched accents as my mortal flesh and organs were slowly, viciously gnawed away. But they made one mistake, Miss Sampson, one great and generous mistake. They left my eyes and ears for last, And so, the last thing I remember seeing before things went for my eyes was Death himself begin to turn the ship beside us to sail away, and from the bottom of his cloak I saw something poking out, something black and scaled like a great lizard. And even as my sight went and my own screams echoed, I fancied I could hear something ringing in my ears from the boat beside me. Something soft and tremulous, but unmistakable in its regularity, the tick, tick, tick of Death's great clock, of time itself, winding out. For I realized now, Death had won the game for my soul before my foolish entreaties, and meant to give me the small mercy of being able to recognize him, should I ever wish to face what my unmanly cowardice had postponed forever. How long I floated in black, soundless agony after that, I cannot tell. Nor can I begin to describe the sensation of feeling new muscles restring themselves across my bones, of new flesh creeping with fiendish itching slowness up those muscles, and of new organs sprouting agonized inside it. I only now know that when, at last, my new eyes squeezed themselves into my aching sockets, the sight which met my eyes was so sweet, it almost made the hellish ordeal worth it. My crew. My crew was alive again. My ship was at full sail, the skull and crossbones flying triumphantly atop the mast. I was no longer tied to the mast, but, I now realized, had fallen to my knees before it, but was free again. And I was cold, for I soon realized that my tormentors had allowed my body to grow new flesh. It had not been able to grow new clothes, which meant that I was entirely naked. Can you imagine, Miss Sampson? I, a captain, naked before my crew. Now that he mentioned it, Flora could imagine it, which was precisely the problem. Despite the soul-searing terror of the narrative up to this point, she could feel a faint scarlet blush stealing up her neck at this last detail. She coughed. It sounds dreadfully embarrassing. Hawkins laughed. Embarrassing? Yes, I suppose it might have been. For another man, at another time. But I was so grateful to be free of pain, and to see my crew alive, that it only made me laugh. I sprang to my feet and tried to embrace the first man I saw, but he quite reasonably jumped back, shocked that his captain should try to embrace him, let alone in his natural state. It was then that I began to wonder if they'd been aware of my presence at all before then, or if life and death had simply veiled my agonized form from them until its awful metamorphosis into undeath was complete. But either way, all was soon set right. My bosun took me in hand and guided me to my cabin, where he helped me to dress, albeit in a set of clothes so ornamental that, even at my height of infamy, I would have considered them excessive. I would not remark upon it, except that it was in noticing that inconsistency that I began to notice all the others. For one thing, my cabin was piled high with old issues of the Eton Chronicle, as if the dear old masters had somehow managed to find a carrier willing to take it to the Spanish Main, let alone onto a ship owned by an infamous privateer. But more than that, when I actually tried speaking to the bosun Smee, who I remembered as a cussed old salt known for his faculty with the cat, I found that his personality had somehow become not merely gentle, but actually childlike. I had much the same experience when I left the cabin and called the ship to assembly, or rather tried to call it, only to discover that discipline on the ship was non-existent because the crew, while they looked like my crew and sounded like my crew, had also regressed into seeming childishness. In fact, when I spoke sharply to one or two of them and told them to look sharp, tears came to their eyes, and one fellow even began to suck his thumb. I might have laughed, only when I saw it I began to fear that a terrible trick had been played upon me due to a careless omission on my part. That is to say, I had asked Life and Death to return my ship and my crew, but I had not asked for my crew to become back sane. Which is why, instead of my old crew of hardened pirates, I now found myself saddled with a ship full of childlike half-wits in their guise. A part of me was tempted to despair right then, but my manful spirit overcame the urge, so I had what was, effectively, a crew of boys. So what? Boys might learn as well as anyone, might mature as well as anyone, even if I'd have to be gentler with them. And anyway, what did it matter? We'd all been granted life in death, after all, hadn't we? We could not die, could not be killed. I had forever to teach them to return to their old ways if I wanted it, and none could take it from me. And so, I resolved to be patient and gentle, until such time as they could recover their old natures. Oh, a lesser captain might have forced them all off the plank, Miss Sampson, to be sure, but not me. Not Jazz Hook of the Jolly Roger. I loved my men. For them, I had endured hell twice. To reawaken their old souls after that was nothing. And I will say this, for all their lack of maritime discipline, their old instincts for how to sail a ship did at least seem to be intact. What's more, discipline turned out to be unnecessary because none of them seemed to have any desire to slack at his duties. Rather, they treated the sailing of the ship as one great delightful game and played their parts without complaint as we drifted pleasantly for almost an hour when a cry went up from the crow's nest. "Land!" the voice shouted above. "Land to starboard!" Now, you must understand, while I was relieved by this, what captain does not feel relief at the prospect of restocking his provisions? I was not particularly surprised. We had, after all, been attacked off the coast of Florida. It was not impossible that in the days of agony since then, we drifted toward some island or perhaps toward Florida itself. When I drew my spyglass and looked to starboard, I expected to see one of any number of a dozen familiar ports growing closer. But I didn't. Quite the opposite. The island I beheld then was no island I'd ever seen in my life. In truth, it did not look like any island on any map I'd ever beheld, nor was there any sign of civilization to be seen at a distance. At this, my heart grew apprehensive. How far had we sailed when I writhed in agony, and for how long? I decided I'd have to wait for night and judge by the stars, for it would not do to leave my ship docked at a savage island indefinitely. However, having resolved this, the thrill of discovery took me, and I began to think of the stories told by boys of unknown islands where pirate crews might secret away treasure, or even of Columbus and Pizarro. Might I, James Hook, join such august ranks as a discoverer of new worlds, and after facing down death and his companion? I would be the stuff of legends, Miss Sampson, the stuff of children's stories. Hawkins began to laugh bitterly. And oh, how right I was. How damnable the results. Yes, indeed. I was the first to discover that hellish place, that haven of infantile cruelty, that eternal torture chamber, that netherland. Had I known what awaited us on that island, I would have seized the wheel and tried to drag the ship off course, or perhaps even to wreck it, rather than go 1 yard closer. But I did not know, and so permitted life and death's true torment to begin. We made landfall within a quarter of an hour, and no sooner did we drop our anchor than the wind which carried us stopped instantly. It did not rise again. No, not once in years, perhaps centuries, did the wind ever rise, which meant that we, poor devils, were left marooned on that island. This might have been an escape under other circumstances, For at least it might have led the poor devils under my command to starve. But not there. For you see, our stores never ran dry. No matter how indulgently we plundered them, the day after they'd always be as full as if we had not touched a crumb or drank a drop. And as I was soon to learn, that was the least, and the least terrible, of what each new day would restore. Naturally, I organized a search party to explore the island, planning to make a map of its dimensions and see if it were truly as deserted as it looked. But here, I don't suppose I can manage to keep you in suspense. You know, of course, that it was not deserted. No, as I was soon to learn, it was very much inhabited, but not by men, by demons, deliberately selected and encouraged by Life and Death herself to plague me. The first of these demons we encountered were the natives, though, quite honestly, I hesitate to call them that. I'm a pirate, Miss Sampson. I have had dealings with native tribes, after all. There was a kinship between people like me and people like them in our desire to plunder the respectable European settler for all he was worth. I even know a few of their tongues and understand too well the queer species of warlike honor which attends the native's mind. These natives, however, had no honor, warlike or otherwise. Indeed, they were less like a real tribe than like a particularly nasty child's idea of one. Yet for all that, they fought like devils, and had the minds to match, for their ambush caught us completely by surprise, and before we even knew what was happening, 3 of my men lay dead. I desperately tried to mount a counterattack, but my men, being mental children, were so frightened that they broke into a panicked retreat, which became a bloody rout. I was lucky to get back to the ship with a handful of men still alive and to draw up the lifeboats before our attackers could commandeer them. I thought surely this would be enough to keep us safe. After all, surely no man, native or European, could cross deep water without drowning. Which was true. No man could. But that was before I met the boy. Hawkins' hands began to shake, and he stood hastily from his desk. My apologies, Miss Sampson, but if I'm to continue, some liquid courage is in order. He crossed to a large globe in the corner of the room and pulled it upward to reveal several decanters full of unidentifiable spirits with glasses to match. Hawkins uncorked one and poured himself a generous glass before knocking it back in one gulp and pulling a face. Then he held an unspoiled glass out to Flora. Anything for you, Miss Sampson? Rum? Whiskey? Flora shook her head, half in answer, half in disbelief, at being offered rum by Captain Hook. No, thank you. Hawkins nodded, already in the act of refilling his glass. As you wish. Another swallow. Right. To the most important part of the story, I suppose. He reseated himself and sighed. You know, when Mr. Barry first showed me his play, Miss Sampson, I was furious with him. It felt like a betrayal of everything I had told him about my singular experience. How can you make that thing your hero? I bellowed. If I still had my hook, I'd open your throat for it. The poor fellow took it quite well, though. Now, Jimmy, that's what he called me, in order to differentiate his name from mine. Be reasonable. Think what you've told me of your exploits, old boy. I simply can't make people root for an infamous blackguard of the Spanish Main to kill a child. But it wasn't a child, I shouted back. It was a demon, Mr. Barry, a demon. You know that better than anyone. It doesn't matter what I know, Jimmy. What matters is what I can convince people to believe. And you do me a dishonor in saying I made Peter my hero. If you'll turn on to the end, you'll see he ends up a worse scoundrel than you. I'm being practical, Jimmy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to twist your story beyond all recognition. The central theme is, that children are cruel. It may take a bit for people to see how much that's true, but it comes in at the end. Hawkins shook his head. Well, of course, he was telling the truth, and he knew his business better than I, Miss Sampson, for his play has made both of us rich men. And I suppose there are limits to what the stage can show, limits which make my story very difficult to convey in a convincing way. But that does not change the truth. Which brings me back to my first meeting with the boy, with Pan, which, believe me, is the only name I ever called it. Jim Barry invented that Peter part to humanize the beast. But you can't humanize what is not human, and Pan was not human. I knew that the moment I first beheld it, soaring toward us, its childlike body held up by the same ghastly sunbeam dust which fell from the wings of my scarab tormentors as they ate my body. But worse still than that was the thrill of recognition I felt when I saw its face and realized this was no mere child, for in its leering, cruel, juvenile features, I beheld nothing less than a perfect replica of my own features when I was a boy. It landed on the ship and brandished a sword. Well, what could I do? I ordered my men to kill it, whatever it was, and God bless them, they certainly tried. But here, too, fresh horrors were to be found, for when it began to fight, I saw in its effortless, graceful, perfect, good form a perfect image of how I must have fought when I first struck down my comrades on that first naval vessel. It even knew how to box as I did, complete with the mighty left hook I had perfected. And as it cut through my men like butter, I finally understood the full depth of life and death's cruelty. She had returned my crew and my ship to me, but only to deliver us into battle with the embodiment of what had gotten my crew killed and me damned in the first place. My own childish inability to bear authority or to accept limitations of any kind. After all, had I not become a pirate because I wanted to rise higher than I could in polite society? Well, if rising higher than I ought to was what I wanted, then naturally the demon sent to mock me would take the form of a flying boy. Had I not slaughtered men who trusted me and their captain with them out of pique? Why, then the demon would exact the same revenge on me that I was the captain. Of course, I had also refused to accept death, willingly damning not only my soul, my own soul, but the souls of all my crew, in order to avoid that last shred of consequence for my actions. But this, I admit, I did not see how the creature could imitate, at least not yet. All I knew was that I would have to close with it, with this awful mirror of the cruel, callow, thoughtless boy I'd been, and kill it if I could. But I could not. God, not even if I had 100 men could I have done that. The creature was so devilishly quick, so infernally graceful, and so utterly fearless that I could have soon have fought the wind. It disarmed me in seconds, pinned me to the ship's deck with an agonizing sword thrust into my gullet, and then began what I was soon to learn was its favorite grisly game. It pulled my organs out, just as living death fey accomplices had done. It flayed away my skin with a carving knife. It pulled my muscles from my bones and sliced my eyes and tongue and ears away with all the careless, cruel curiosity of a child pulling wings off a butterfly. And then it left me, once more in soundless darkness, to scream and suffer on the deck of my ship. And here, the full extent of the nightmare revealed itself. For, like Prometheus, screaming each day under the ministrations of the hawk, once more my organs regrew, my muscles restrung themselves, and my flesh crept back. And once more, when I opened my eyes to the sound of a child's imitation of a cock crow, I found myself standing naked among my men, alive again, and childlike as before, with the ship beneath our feet where no sign of blood or pain was to be found. In fact, I soon learned that my men remembered nothing at all of the previous day or of its horrors. In their minds, we had simply docked at Netherland and had been there forever. Ha! Well, even if they didn't remember, Miss Sampson, I did. And because I was still a fool with a fighting spirit, I fancied that the prison I found myself in could somehow be outwitted. That if I were clever enough or discovered the right stratagem, I could conquer the entire island, kill its demonic inhabitants, and make it a safe haven for me and my men to spend eternity. Since I soon discovered that the hold was full, which obviated the need to go to ashore, I spent the rest of the day drilling my men in tactics and fighting until well into the night. And when I finally went to sleep in my cabin, I dreamt of vengeance. But when I woke, once more to the sound of that damnable child's crowing, such dreams faded with the rest. For once more my men remembered nothing of the previous day. However, this time, I didn't even have time to try to reteach them, because in mere hours the ship was under attack again, which was when I discovered the first of several things which would ultimately permit my escape. Pan was not alone. Well, really, why should he be? After all, Life and Death had not only me, but my entire crew to torture, if she liked. It was not so impossible to imagine that she might have created child versions of all of us to aid in the torture. Yet when I beheld the boys who fought at the demon's side as it landed on our ship and began its merciless attack, I knew that this was not the way of things. None of these boys acted in the least bit like any member of my crew. They did not indeed even resemble them. They really seemed to be just normal boys, albeit under the spell of the demon, which, despite the ruthless efficiency of their assault, made my curiosity bloom. If these boys were not creations of Life and Death, but were rather actual children, then how had they been brought to Netherland, and for what purpose? Of course, this thought did nothing to prevent their cutting their way through my men with ridiculous ease, nor did it prevent the demon from once more humiliating me and stripping away my body with its usual sadistic glee. But even as I howled in agony for yet another awful night, until the thing's crowing roused me again, that thought kept me sane, for in it I saw just a glimmer of hope. After all, if those boys had come from somewhere, then there must be another way in to Netherland. And if there was a way in, then surely there was a way out. It was small hope, but it was hope I needed, as the countless days and countless defeats crashed down upon me despite all my best efforts at preparing my men or securing the ship against attack. I could not understand it at the time, but I do now. Hawkins' eyes burned and he crossed to the globe, filling another glass with rum and knocking it back greedily. Then he turned to Florida, his eyes haunted. You know, I assume, Miss Sampson, that when children play at Peter Pan, he spat the name, the strongest always choose to be Peter. They force the baby to be Hook. His hands clenched. The baby, Miss Sampson. That's where the canker gnaws, and not as Mr. Barry would have it, because it hurts my pride. No, that canker gnaws because only now do I see that in these children games, the fate of my men was constantly decided. The fact that the pirates never win when children play at Neverland, as Mr. Barry calls that circle of hell, was the precise reason why my stratagems availed me nothing, and I was forced to watch my poor crew die, again and again and again and again, sometimes in the most horrible ways, and always to cursedly be reborn in their old childlike state the next day. It was the stuff of the darkest hole in Tartarus, Miss Sampson, my dance with Pan, with him as the boulder and I as Sisyphus. And for long eons of time, I truly despaired of ever escaping that hell. However, despite the grotesque tedium and monotony of my existence as a perpetual sufferer of cruelties at the hands of Pan and his native allies, I remained a thinking man, which was what finally permitted me to escape the tedium and monotony, if not the grotesquerie. All right, I said to myself, so I will be forced to suffer most every night until Pan crows, only for the exercise to repeat itself the next day. Let us take that for granted. If that's the case, then there is no reason for me to care for my safety, which will be compromised no matter what. Yet I still have an advantage. Unlike my men, I can remember, I can learn, and therefore I can learn where the walls of this cage lie, and perhaps perceive what holes might be found within them. So, when I next awoke, screaming from my near-nightly agonies at Pan's hands, I did not stay on the ship. Instead, I led my men into Netherland again, and this time, because I knew where the natives had laid their traps before, I avoided them. Oh, and it took us no more than 5 minutes to find more traps, to be sure, and to die in yet more horrible ways, but the next day, I avoided those traps as well. I spent years memorizing every single dishonorable trick the island could throw at me to thwart my progress, and then years more learning its geography. And then, only then, after years of endless, frustrating pain, did I begin to strain at the bars of my cage. My first plan was obvious. I would capture one of Pan's boys and torture the location of his leader's hiding place from him. But all attempts at this failed. Even when I could catch one of them, Pan would always arrive too quickly for me to break him. Though I did learn one useful thing from these failures. The boys feared both pain and death. They did not know that they would revive upon the morrow, no matter what happened. Knowing this, I immediately set about capturing a native and seeing if the same was true of them. Yes, it was. Which was the first moment I began to realize that my knowledge of how the prison worked was an advantage. I knew I would suffer, no matter what happened, and be reborn, but my enemies did not, which meant I could threaten them with tortures and deaths that, while impermanent, still had the power to compel truth. Oh, yes, I would never manage to carry them off. Pan would always arrive to prevent that, but my enemies never remembered this, no more than my men did. Unfortunately, however, torturing and killing the natives proved as useless as the boys. They had no knowledge of the subject I was most keen to understand. No, they did not know where Pan's boys came from, no more than I did. No, they did not know how he flew. No, they did not know how to leave Netherland. They had no consciousness that there was anywhere else in the world. The only thing of use I was able to get out of one of them was that their princess might know how to reach Pan's hideout, but even this was cold comfort, for without years more of memorizing the natives' movements, I could not possibly hope to capture the girl in question. Yet, what other choice did I have? If this was my only way to make a fiend vulnerable, then it was what I would have to do. So with a great deal of fatalistic dread, I started once more trying to fight the natives, fruitless as it always seemed. It took years of dying and agony before I could fight them to a standstill. It took a decade more to rout them, and it took yet one more decade to defeat them and keep their princess alive. But she was made of sterner stuff than I expected. Even the few times when I was able to put her to the question, she held up under torture as a queen ought, and never once revealed any knowledge of Pan's whereabouts. However, I do not begrudge the child, or illusion of one, or whatever she was, because in my efforts to question her, I inadvertently learned something far more important. You see, Miss Sampson, Pan did not like how thoroughly I refused to be broken, and nor, I assume, did his mistress. And he particularly did not like that I was able to hurt his fellow tormentors, however briefly, which is what led him finally to slip up in one of our countless duels aboard the ship. For you see, once he beat me, he'd grown bored of pinning me to the deck, at least right away, and had since taken to chopping off my limbs, which of course would always grow back the next day. However, one day, when he managed to sever my left hand, a sensation I was so used to that I managed to choke back my cry of pain, I heard something I did not expect. Something I had almost forgotten could exist. In my countless years of savage combat with Netherlands' many cruelties, the sound of a ticking clock coming from beneath the ship. And because I was not yet pinned to the deck, I managed to back away from Pan just enough to sneak a single look over the edge of the ship and behold the great black crocodile beneath, staring up at me with the hollow eyes of death, and the sound of the ticking deep within its gullet, which was when an idea finally struck me. "Oh, mercy, Pan!" I cried, trying as best as I could for the terror of my early days in my fiend's clutches. "Mercy! Do what ye like with me, you heartless boy, only don't throw me hand to that crocodile, I beg ye." And of course, because for all his immortality and strength, Pan was still a spiteful, hateful, cruel child, he laughed. And then, without so much as a second thought, he threw my hand down in the water, where the crocodile snatched it in his jaws and swallowed it whole. And though I screamed and cried and flubbered after that, as I had so many times before under his ministrations, in my heart, Miss Sampson, I had hope for the first time. For when the croc had swallowed and an experiment had begun, and I had only to wait and see if it bore fruit. So you can imagine my utter delight when Pan crowed the next day, and instead of waking to find myself restored completely, oh wonder, my hand still pained me, because it was still missing. My experiment had worked, and thanks be to God, I now knew that there was a way of escape, should I ever be desperate enough to take it, which was that I were to throw myself to that crocodile, to death, as I should have done when he first sailed by. I would finally be free of the horrors of Netherland. Oh, I almost threw myself in the croc's jaws that very second, Miss Sampson. But I was held back, not just by fear, but by remorse. After all, to give myself up to death, while it would free me from the horrors of Netherland, it would leave my poor, childish crew with no hope of escape. No. For all the many lines I had crossed since arriving in that dreadful place, I still cared for my crew as if they were brothers or even sons, Miss Sampson, and I could not bear to do something so selfish, not when the only people who had ever loved me in my life would be left to hell. At first I considered making them all walk the plank, only to follow me myself, when the last had been eaten. But the mere thought infuriated me. The poor devils would be terrified. They would not know that their captain did it as a mercy. They would not understand that their captain did it as a mercy. And why should they be forced to endure it? Why, after all the pain that we had been all through, should we have been required to accept such a dreadful end? It would make the whole thing pointless. It would insult all we had already endured. No. Throwing us all into the jaws of death was not the way. It might suffice as a last resort, but not until we'd tried everything to achieve what I now suspected would truly defeat our captors: the death of Pan, and of the fragment of life and death that attended and protected him. Yes, if I could accomplish that even once, even if it didn't take, then the torture chamber would lose its meaning. I would have every entity within Netherland at my mercy, and then, and life and death's cruel game would be defeated on its own terms. She would have no choice but to release us all, simply to avoid my compounding the humiliation. And so, now, finally possessed of a plan, however difficult, I returned to my endless game of attrition with Pan and his mistress. And even though they kept visiting agony upon agony on me now, I began to almost relish the frustration with which they inflicted it. They, after all, had to win this game every time, whereas I only had to win once. Once more, now that I had my way out, I no longer felt like a prisoner to their ministrations, but rather like a willing participant who was simply biding his time until he could turn the tables. Which is why, slowly, day after day, hour by hour, minute by minute, stroke by stroke, and scream by scream, I began to learn how to fight Pan himself, and to begin to penetrate his good form, which at once seemed invincible. And then one day, in a blast of pure luck, the final puzzle piece snapped into place. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The moment when, peering through my spyglass, I caught sight of Pan soaring down to Netherland's surface. But not alone, no. This time, he had a company, a girl and 2 boys. Well, that answered one question. Where did Pan's companions come from? But there was yet another, more tantalizing detail. The fiendish shard of life and death which accompanied him tried to send the girl to her death almost as soon as they got within sight of the island. It was a maddeningly suggestive detail, and it sent my mind whirring such that I barely even noticed my surroundings for hours. But at last, something occurred to me. Something blindingly obvious, and yet only noticeable now that it was no longer true. The fiend only ever took boys. This was the first time it, had brought back a girl, a living girl, not an illusion like the natives' princess or the mermaids, and something in that threatened life and death, though for what reason I could not imagine. Mr. Barry, of course, credited the whole thing to romantic jealousy in his play, which he knows is an absurd notion as well as I. Still, if the motive is not real, the actions are, and it was only in spying on the boys with all the tools of stealth and skullduggery I had learned to employ that I began to suspect why. Because, you see, Mr. Barry tells the truth at one point. Pan had brought the girl back to be a mother, and in that little detail I began to spy the truth. For what is a mother, Miss Sampson, but a giver of life? Real life, not the counterfeit mockery of life and death. That child's very presence on an island full of boys was an implicit challenge to the order of the fiend which ruled Netherland. For should she accept a union with any of the boys, life would intrude in full and potentially break the power of life and death forever. But it was only when I woke the next day that I realized what a challenge she truly posed, because for the first time when I checked our stores, I found that they were depleted. I questioned my men and found that they remembered the day that it had passed, which is when I knew what my next step must be. I must capture the girl. Oh, not out of some perverse desire, but for a simpler reason. Because Pan would come to save her, and because I had not yet found the means to beat him, he would succeed, which meant he would make the child desire him, and set in motion the means by which life and death's hold on Netherland might be broken forever. Oh, yes, if I could make the whole pantomime convincing enough, then there would be no need to defeat Pan myself. His very urges as a boy, if boy he was, would do the work for me. And so, with planning as careful and as devious as any I had devised when I was still the terror of the Spanish Main, I set about laying my final trap. I kidnapped the girl. I took steps to kill Pan, which I knew would not succeed, but which I knew would make her despair of his survival. I even managed to use the wedge that the girl's presence drove between Pan and his fragment of life and death to make the hideous sprite reveal the location of his hiding place before trapping it in a lamp and tossing it to the bottom of the sea, so that if it were possible to kill Pan, I would accomplish it and free us all no matter what happened. Then I waited. As I predicted, Pan came. He fought me, and while I came as close as I had ever come to defeating him, even at my best, I knew I was still no match for him. But what was more, I knew that my plan could not work if the girl believed he had spared my life. So I lured him to the topmost part of the ship until we were overlooking the ocean, and when he finally showed his frustration and kicked me in the ocean, I could hardly contain my glee. "Bad form, Peter," I shouted as I plummeted toward the open crocodile's jaws, laughing as I thought of how, in finally accepting the embrace of death, had finally sprung a trap which might unravel my great mistake once and for all. I did not even bother to struggle as death caught me in his jaws. He paused and smiled softly, a hint of mourning entering his face. Flora, however, was too fascinated to let the moment pass. She leaned forward in her seat and, without thinking, immediately asked, "And then?" Hawkins looked up at her in mild surprise. "And then?" he repeated, as a hollow look came into his eyes. "Then there was pain, Miss Sampson. Pain beyond all other pain I had yet experienced. Pain that could unman any man, even a terror of the Spanish Main. I felt every bone crack beneath the crocodile's teeth. I felt the acid of its stomach peel away my flesh. Every inch of my physical form was violated, and I was sure that this time I would not wake, for it was Death himself who inflicted the wounds, not his cruel counterpart or one of her minions. But as you can see, I was mistaken, for my soul still belonged to life and death, even if my body no longer was her prey. She had not broken her bargain with me, even if I had fled from it, which is why when I woke next, it was to find myself shivering, naked, and yet alive. But not this time in Netherland. No, this time I recognized the land I was on, dimly, as if from a dream, as the soil of what was once the Spanish Main. Florida, to be exact, though certainly not the Florida I remembered, for, as you so cleverly realized, I'm a stranger in this century. As for how I managed to steal and rob and find my way back to England, well, that tale alone could take hours in its own right. What is important, however, is that I made my way to Eton, where, as you so cleverly noticed, I ripped the records of my attendance out, just as Mr. Barry says. In fact, it was thanks to my return to Eton that Mr. Barry and I first met, for he found me sitting on the college wall, the low one, on which only members of the Pop Society may sit, and there saved me from being accosted by a policeman. It was from there that I told him the story I have just told you, and bless him, though a lesser person would have thought me a madman, Mr. Barry took me in hand and gave me a home and comforts until such time as he could find me a more suitable, more decent engagement. He smiled and sat up in his chair, spreading his hands, which is what brought me, at last, back to dear Eton permanently, where you find me now. They say I teach religion, and I do, though I fear it's rather an overly polite way of describing my true scholarly pursuits, which the other masters frown upon a great deal. You see, Miss Sampson, what I am truly a scholar of is not religion, writ large, but rather a scholar of the geography of hell. He raised one finger and pointed at the maps on the walls, and when Flora looked closer, she saw immediately what he meant. These weren't maps of anywhere on Earth. Rather, they appeared to be hand-drawn maps of various versions of hell, some which even she recognized, Dante and Milton, and others which looked wholly foreign and frightening. A dark smile twisted Hawkins' mouth. I've read every book in every language a man could learn on the subject of hell, Miss Sampson, and for one very simple reason, because I know that my final stratagem failed. Wendy Darling, though that's not the girl's real name, did not conceive a child with Pam. I know because I found her some years ago in a hospital. She was old and gray and her eyes barely worked, but she knew me in an instant, and I had to take great pains to assure her of my kind intentions before she would talk. But eventually talk she did. And because I know what happened after I was eaten, I know that my men are still suffering somewhere in that hellish Netherland, where boys never grow up and pirates always lose their battles and die screaming for their mothers. So I have taken it upon myself to learn all I can of hell, not so I may avoid it, but so that I may know how to enter it again, and in which damnable circle I must look to find the island where the souls of my crew are trapped. What else could I do, Miss Sampson, knowing that is only my folly that put them there? I ask you, what else? Flora waited for him to go on, but when he didn't, she realized the question wasn't rhetorical. But what could she say? She was almost too riveted by the story, and by the haunted dark eyes of James Hawkins, or Gordon, or Hook himself, to speak. She tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry. I don't know, Captain. No? What would you do then, Miss Sampson? Not to save your crew, but to save your family, perhaps your husband. I'm not married. A slight wolfish twinkle entered Hawkins' eyes, then vanished. I beg your pardon. Your mother, then. We all have mothers, after all, except Pan. What would you do to save her from hell? Mama and I don't get on very well, but if she were in hell, Captain, I'd do anything to get her out. Hawkins relaxed, his eyes closing with relief. Thank you, Miss Sampson. He reached into his desk idly, and a moment later she heard a faint metallic click issue from within. Thank you. You've eased my heart on a very important point. Flora smiled, but unbidden, fear was rising in her at the queer, almost predatory look in James Hawkins' eyes. I'm glad. She stood. Well, Captain, this has been most enlightening, but if there's nothing else... A dagger whizzed by her ear as she turned toward the door, burying itself in the wood. The sight froze her for a second, before her feet worked again and she tensed to run. But the movement came too late. The bite of something curved, metal, and razor-sharp was already at her throat. You're not going anywhere, Miss Sampson, purred Jazz Hook, captain of the Jolly Roger. Not now. I'm sorry, but you're simply too valuable. Captain, what are you doing? Exactly what you said a man in my position should do, Miss Sampson. Anything. You see, the one thing I didn't mention about my little journey through the crocodile's gullet is that I didn't make it alone. No, that lamp containing the living shard of life and death got swallowed too. I've kept it, and the fiend within ever since. Until very recently, I had no idea how to use her because I had no idea how one might return to Netherland. But just a few nights ago, I had something of a breakthrough. It was Mr. Barry's play that did it. Fairies, life and death, are bound by belief. Well, the entire world now believes that you can get to Netherland by following the second star to the right, which means I should be able to as well. I've been waiting for an opportunity like this. An opportunity for what? Captain, I don't... Ah, Miss Simpson, don't you remember? The one thing life and death cannot abide in her realm is a woman. A mother, and ideally a mother with child. Oh, I could have snatched any tramp off the street if I wanted, but when you came right into my lap. I'm a pirate, Miss Sampson. I not only take what I want, I take it where I want. Please. Flora stammered, tears of fear suddenly coming to her eyes. Please, But her words were cut off as Hook's one good hand came into view above her, and she beheld what was in it. It was just as he'd said, a horrid miniature mockery on the human form, its gangly limbs twisted, its mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth, its skin white as leprosy, and from its wings, golden and scarab-like, a hail of motes of sunlight fell down onto her eyes. Don't cry, Miss Sampson, breathed Captain James Hook, his voice pregnant with cold mirth. That's not the way to get to Netherland. You know the way from Mr. Barry's play, don't you, Miss Sampson? And it's not tears, no. You think lovely, wonderful thoughts. The room began to spin. And the last thing Flora saw as her body rose into the air was Hook's terrible, beautiful smile. And up we go. And that was Straight On Till Mourning by author Jasper DeWitt, as performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Well, Malcolm, that one had a bit of a bite to it, didn't it?
You could say that. Lost boys, secret histories, and a figure lurking just out of sight. I think it's safe to say that not all childhood stories are meant for children.
And not every hero stays a hero either. Sometimes they live long enough to become something else entirely. Our next tale is about grief, longing, and the things we reach for when we think we have nothing left. But some opportunities, some gifts, come with strings attached. Performed by yours truly, this is To See What You Have Lost by Chilling Tales for Dark Knight's creator Craig Groshek. Part 1. Eliza Harper had stopped counting the days since the last funeral. The first one, her father's, had been marked with the sharp, disoriented pain of sudden loss. The heart attack had come without warning, dropping him to the kitchen floor before she could do anything but watch as paramedics performed chest compressions on his cooling body. The second loss, her uncle, had been an accident, senseless and cruel, a head-on collision on a rain-slick highway. The third, her sister Sophie, had been expected. That was supposed to make it easier. It hadn't. Watching a 16-year-old wither away in a hospital bed, skin stretched thin over delicate bones, was something no amount of mental preparation could soften. Now, grief was something she wore like an old coat. Heavy, familiar, suffocating. Her mother had called that morning, her voice careful, as if testing the ground beneath her. Eliza, sweetheart, I was thinking we could have dinner this week. Just the two of us? I know things have been hard, but I've been busy. Eliza had interrupted, though it wasn't true. She wasn't busy. She'd been ignoring texts, declining invitations, and spending most of her time alone in the greenhouse lab she worked at, surrounded by things that didn't speak or ask how she was feeling. Marion sighed on the other end of the line, but she didn't push. She never did. Well, just let me know, okay? I love you. Eliza hadn't responded before hanging up. She'd driven to work in silence, the morning's overcast sky smearing gray across the horizon, her hands gripping the wheel harder than necessary. The greenhouse, a sprawling structure of glass and steel, should have felt like a sanctuary. She'd always found comfort in the quiet hum of humidity, the sharp scent of soil, and the careful precision of cultivation. But these days, even her plants seemed indifferent. The mistake had happened in the afternoon. She'd been working on a propagation experiment, cutting sections from a rare climbing vine to encourage new growth. It was delicate work, requiring a steady hand, but she'd been distracted, her mind slipping like a fraying rope. The scalpel slipped. She hissed in pain as the blade grazed her palm, a thin line of blood beating along the cut. "Damn it," she cried. Eliza set the scalpel down, pressing a tissue against the wound. She'd have to be more careful. She knew better. With a frustrated sigh, she swept the plant debris into the trash. That was when she noticed it. In the bottom of the propagation tray, half buried beneath discarded leaves, was something she hadn't placed there. A seed. It was unlike any seed she'd ever seen, almost black, but with an unnatural sheen. It was small, smooth, and oddly warm to the touch. Frowning, she picked it up, turning it over between her fingers. There's no logical reason for it to be there. The greenhouse adhered to strict protocols. Every species was accounted for and no cross-contamination was allowed. Taped to the underside of the tray was a small slip of paper. The handwriting, uneven and shaky, was unfamiliar. "To see what you've lost, plant this." Her first thought was that someone was playing a joke. Her second was that she didn't care. Eliza should have tossed it into the trash, dismissing it as nothing, and moved on with her day. Instead, she slipped the seed into the pocket of her lab coat. That night, she planted it. It was a thoughtless act, done more out of impulse than anything else. She found an old ceramic pot tucked away in the corner of her apartment, filled it with soil, and pressed the seed into the dirt with the tip of her finger. She didn't know why she did it, maybe because the message had unsettled her, maybe because something had broken through the dull, suffocating haze of grief for the first time in months. As she watered the soil, a familiar scent drifted through the air. Eliza froze. The scent was impossible. Lavender. Sophie's lavender. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. It was just her imagination. The seed sat silently beneath the soil, unmoving. With a sigh, Eliza turned off the light and went to bed, unaware that by morning, everything would change. Part 2. Eliza woke to the smell of earth and rain. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. The scent was overwhelming, like she had fallen asleep in the greenhouse. But as she opened her eyes, the sight above her drove the last traces of sleep from her mind. A massive vine, thick as an oak, and the color of deep jade, had erupted through her apartment floor and ceiling, twisting up through the rafters. Its roots had split the wooden floorboards apart like brittle bones, curling outward in unnatural spirals. The walls were cracked, tendrils slithering across them like ivy gone rogue, forcing their way into corners and creeping toward the windows. Eliza's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. She pushed herself upright, nearly tripping over the blankets that had tangled around her legs. The room pulsed with life, the vine's surface shifting as though something stirred beneath the thick green skin. Wind rushed past her. She realized with a start that the ceiling had been torn away completely. Where there should have been drywall and insulation, there was nothing but open sky. Deep twilight, with streaks of purple and navy blue stretching out like bruises against the horizon. The air felt impossibly crisp. Too clean, too different. Eliza stumbled forward, her bare feet brushing against the vine. It was warm beneath her fingertips, like living flesh, and she instinctively pulled her hand back. Then she noticed the scent. Not just the scent of soil and green things, but of something more. Her father's aftershave, her uncle's pipe smoke, and, her stomach twisted, lavender again. Sophie's lavender, unforgettable. A voice whispered from above, soft as the wind through the trees. "Eliza." The voice was distant but unmistakable. Her father's voice. This was a dream, she rationalized. It had to be a dream. But the scent, the voice, the warmth of the vine beneath her hands. Her father was gone, buried 6 feet beneath the cold, uncaring earth. She knew this, yet above her was the sound of his voice drifting down from somewhere far beyond the clouds. Eliza swallowed, her throat dry. The vine stretched up, spiraling higher and higher, disappearing into the twilight. There was no logical reason to think it went anywhere at all. But the whisper called again, low and insistent. "Come up, sweetheart. We've missed you." This was insanity. She should have called someone, the fire department, her mother. She should have done anything other than what she was considering. But then there was another whisper. "Eliza, hurry!" This one stopped her cold. Sophie. For a long moment she stood, frozen, her mind caught in a brutal, silent battle. The logical part of her, what remained of the scientist, the botanist, the woman who believed in structure and reason, was screaming at her to turn away, to leave the apartment, call her mother and get help. But the other part, the one that had been hollowed out by loss and regret, the part that still woke up expecting to hear Sophie padding barefoot into the kitchen for tea, the part that would have done anything for one more moment, that part stepped forward. She reached for the vine, her fingers dug into the ridges along its sides, and she began to climb. The ascent was easier than it should have been. The vine's surface was firm but pliable, the grooves perfectly shaped for her fingers and the arches of her feet. There was no wind, no resistance, nothing to shake her balance as she scaled higher and higher, her apartment vanishing below. The world was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves far above. She climbed for what seemed like hours, her arms burning, yet she did not stop. At some point she realized she was no longer climbing into the sky. She was climbing through it. The color around her darkened, shifting from twilight into something more like deep water, a midnight void stretching outward in all directions. She glanced down, but her apartment was gone. There was nothing beneath her but endless dark. Panic threatened to creep in, but before she could let herself understand the horror of what she had done, she saw the first hints of light above. Not sunlight, not city lights, something else. A glow, soft and golden, like the lime of a home long forgotten. It beckoned. She climbed the last few feet, her muscles screaming, and pulled herself up onto solid ground. Eliza took in the sight before her. She stood on the edge of a forest, not a normal forest, not like the one she had hiked with her father in the summers of her childhood, but something older, ancient. Trees were impossibly tall, their trunks thick with moss and gnarled roots, their canopies stretching toward a sky that wasn't quite a sky at all. It looked painted, a dusky, perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, the hues shifting in slow, imperceptible waves. And beyond the trees, nestled within the heart of the forest, was a house. Eliza's stomach lurched. It was her childhood home. Every detail was perfect, from the faded blue paint to the chipped stone pathway leading up to the porch. The windows glowed with warm light, and the scent of roasted coffee and pipe smoke drifted through the air. It wasn't possible. She stepped forward, feet moving of her own accord, her hands trembling, and the front door creaked open. And there, standing in the doorway, was her father. Her eyes shone with quiet warmth, the same warmth she had ached for since the day they lowered his casket into the ground. A smile stretched across his face. "Eliza, sweetheart," he said softly, "you're home." She stumbled forward, her vision blurring. Her father opened his arms, and she fell into them. The embrace was real, solid and warm. She choked out the only thing she could. "Dad?" His hand smoothed over her hair just like it used to. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's okay now." Behind him, inside the house, her late uncle grinned at her from the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. And standing at the top of the stairs, watching her with bright, eager eyes, was Sophie. Eliza's legs nearly buckled. Her sister's voice was exactly as she remembered it, soft and sweet, carrying a hint of laughter. "I've been waiting for you, Eliza." The last thing she noticed before stepping inside was the whisper of wind through the trees behind her. Something inhuman stirred in the forest, watching, waiting. But Eliza didn't turn around. She didn't see it. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. Part 3. The warmth of the house enveloped her like a familiar blanket, thick with the scent of roasted coffee, pipe smoke, and something sweeter. Vanilla, maybe, or cinnamon. The lighting was soft, golden, perfect. The kind of glow that only existed in those rose-tinted corners of memory. Eliza stood in the entryway, her hands trembling at her sides. Her father was still smiling. His eyes crinkled at the corners, just like they always did when he was proud of her or amused by some clumsy mistake she'd made as a child. "You look pale, sweetheart," he said gently, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Come, sit down. You must be exhausted." Her mind screamed that this was impossible, that she had climbed into the sky, into nowhere, that she had abandoned reason the moment she reached for that vine. But another part of her, the part that had spent the last year drowning in loss, in cold, unrelenting silence, desperately wanted to believe. She let her father guide her to the couch. Uncle Peter grinned at her from the other side of the room, a whiskey glass dangling from his fingers. "It's about time you got here, kid. We were starting to think you got lost." She let out a shaky breath. How is this?" "Don't strain yourself with all that," Peter said, waving a dismissive hand. "You're home now. That's all that matters." Home. She hadn't realized how much she had been craving that word. A giggle from the staircase made her stiffen. She turned just in time to see Sophie bounding down the steps, bare feet barely touching the wood, her dark hair swinging over her shoulders. Sophie, 16 years old forever. She threw her arms around Eliza, holding her tight, her familiar lavender scent wrapped around them both. Eliza clutched her sister, pressing her face into her hair. Sophie was here, alive, whole. The machines, the hospital rooms, the unbearable last days. All of it had been a mistake. "I thought I lost you," Eliza whispered. Sophie pulled back just enough to grin up at her. "You did." The words were so casual, so wrong, that Eliza almost pulled away. But then Sophie laughed, light and musical, and any unease slipped away like mist. She was here. That was all that mattered. The first few days, if they were days, passed in a dreamlike haze. She never felt tired, never felt hungry, but she still ate. The meals were perfect, exactly the way she remembered them. Her father's Sunday roast, Peter's butter-drenched garlic bread, Sophie's favorite strawberry tarts. The conversations felt effortless, as if no time had passed at all. Her father asked about her work, nodding along with her rambling explanation of propagation cycles and plant hybridization. Uncle Peter told the same jokes he had when she was younger, laughter spilling from his lips like old songs. Sophie clung to her, always within reach, laughing, teasing, just as she had been before the sickness hollowed her out. And yet, there were cracks, small things, easy to dismiss at first. A photograph on the mantel that she didn't remember taking. A room at the end of the hallway that no one ever entered. A moment just before she fell asleep where Sophie's breath hitched. Not a sigh or a snore, just something mechanical and too precise. And then there were the nights. The first time she woke to the low guttural howling from the forest, she thought she'd imagined it. It wasn't the sound of the wind, nor the calls of wolves or owls, or anything that belonged to the world she knew. This was something else, something hungry. She sat up in bed, her skin cold despite the thick blanket around her. The house was silent, but the howling, the low, wretched, twisting sound, was growing louder. She moved to the window, pressing a hand to the cool glass. The forest beyond the house seemed thicker and darker than before, as if the trees had crept closer while she wasn't looking. And in the distance, just at the edge of the tree line, something shifted. A shape, a figure. Too thin, too still. It was watching the house, watching her. She took a step back. Behind her, a voice murmured, soft and coaxing, "Don't go outside, Eliza." She turned sharply. Her father stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the golden light of the hall. His face was calm and unreadable. "There's nothing out there for you," he said gently. She opened her mouth, protest, to say something rational about how she was a scientist and wasn't the type to be frightened by the dark. But she was, and she had been, ever since she was a child, and her father, was standing here telling her it was safer inside. So she nodded and let him guide her back to bed. And when she closed her eyes, she ignored the whisper of leaves against the window pane, ignored the feeling that something was pacing at the edge of the trees, monitoring her every move. The second time she woke to the sound, she wasn't alone. Sophie was sitting at the foot of her bed, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the window. Eliza sat up slowly. "Soph?" Her sister didn't move. The howling outside was quieter this time, closer. "Sophie?" she tried again. This time her sister turned to look at her. Her face was wrong. Her expression was blank, her eyes dark and unfocused. A trick of the light, Eliza told herself. Just the shadows playing across her features. Sophie blinked, and for one terrible second, her mouth moved without opening. "They were waiting for you, Eliza." The voice that came out was hers, but not hers. Eliza froze. The house groaned around them, the walls stretching and shifting. Then Sophie smiled, her face smoothing back into something warm and normal. "You talk in your sleep," she said, her voice light again. "You were mumbling something about Mom." The word sent a sharp spike through her chest. Mom. Why hadn't she thought of her mother before now? The realization made her stomach twist. How long had it been since she remembered the world below? Sophie slid off the bed, stretching her arms. "Come on," she said. "Dad's making pancakes." Eliza hesitated. For the first time since she arrived, the warmth of the house didn't feel comforting. It felt smothering. She followed Sophie downstairs, but as she passed the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't be. Her sister's reflection was still smiling, even though Sophie had already turned away. Part 4. Eliza could no longer remember how long she'd been in the house. The passage of time had become something fluid, something unsteady. The sky beyond the trees never changed. It remained locked in a permanent state of dusk, the light neither brightening nor fading. She tried, at first, to measure the days by counting the meals, but even that had proven unreliable. The food never ran out. The plates were always full, the coffee always steaming, as if no time had passed at all between one moment and the next. That should have unsettled her. She should have been more concerned. But the house was so warm. her father's laughter so genuine, and Sophie's presence so intoxicatingly familiar that it was easier not to question it. She barely thought about the world below anymore, barely thought about her job, her apartment, the endless cycle of mornings spent alone and nights spent staring at the ceiling. Her mother had been calling her every day before she climbed the vine, hadn't she? Her mind grasped for the memory, but it was like trying to hold on to mist, slipping, shifting, disappearing before she could solidify it into something real. There was a knock on the door. She looked up, startled. Her father and Uncle Peter had been in the middle of some conversation about fishing, but neither of them reacted to the sound. They went on speaking as if nothing had happened, Peter chuckling into his drink, her father nodding along with a contented hum. Eliza frowned. The knock came again. She rose from the couch, hesitant, her fingers curling into her palms. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Her father smiled at her. "Sit back down, sweetheart. It's just the wind." Eliza's frown deepened. The wind didn't knock. Another knock, louder this time. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her expression neutral. "Eliza," she said softly, "come help me with something in the kitchen." Eliza glanced at the door, then back at her sister. Something wasn't right. Sophie had never spoken like that before, not in life, not in death. There was something rehearsed about it, more like the echo of a memory than something real. "Eliza," Sophie said again. The knock came once more. Eliza turned toward the door, her feet moving before she could fully process the decision. Sophie stepped forward, blocking her path. "Don't!" she whispered. Eliza froze and stared at her sister. Sophie had never told her no before. She had never looked at her like that before, pleading, wide-eyed, as if Eliza was about to step off the edge of a cliff. The knock came again, harder, almost urgent. A voice followed, muffled by the wood, barely audible. "Eliza," it called. "Eliza, are you there?" She knew that voice. Every muscle in her body tensed. Her mother. The sound of it sent a shudder through her chest, a ripple into something deep, something real. She turned to Sophie. Her sister didn't move. Her father and Uncle Peter were still talking, still laughing, as if nothing outside this house existed. Eliza took a step toward the door. Sophie's expression collapsed into something desperate. "She doesn't belong here," Sophie whispered. Eliza's stomach turned. The knocking continued, harder now, more insistent. "Eliza, please." Her mother sounded close, too close. Eliza's throat tightened. "I have to." "She's not real," Sophie said. Eliza faltered. Her mother was real. She had to be. She had called Eliza before she climbed the vine, before the seed, before... hadn't she? The thought swayed, unsteady. "Please, Eliza." The voice beyond the door cracked, strained with something raw and desperate. A sharp pain lanced through Eliza's skull. Her vision blurred and split, as if pulled apart at seams. Images flickered in her mind, her mother's hands on her shoulders shaking her, sobbing, her apartment, her job, her name being spoken over and over as if someone was trying to keep her from slipping into a place she could never come back from. Sophie reached for her. Her hands were too cold. Eliza pulled free from her grasp and threw open the door. The world beyond the threshold was wrong. The forest and the sky weren't there anymore. There was only the hospital room, and her mother, her real mother, sitting in a chair beside the bed, clutching Eliza's limp hand in hers. Her face was worn with exhaustion, her eyes rimmed red. The doorframe around her fractured, splintering into something impossible, half of it leading to the warmth of the house, the other opening into the white, sterile light of reality. Eliza swooned. Her father's voice, the version of him that had never died, spoke behind her, calm and patient. "You don't have to go back, sweetheart." She turned. They were all watching her. Sophie, Peter, her father. Eliza looked at them, at the warm glow, at the laughter, at the place where no one had to die, no one had to grieve, no one had to suffer through the unbearable weight of being left behind. Then she looked at her mother, real, tired, and alive. And she stepped forward. The house screamed. Not a sound, not exactly, something deeper. It reverberated through her bones and rattled through her skull, splitting through the air like the sound of shattering glass. She felt cold hands grab at her, dragging her backward into the warmth. Eliza screamed, fought, and threw herself through the doorway. The moment she crossed the threshold, she collapsed. The light was too bright. She gasped, choking, her lungs burning. Somewhere close, she heard a familiar, insistent beeping noise. She was in a hospital. For a moment, she was certain she'd fallen through dimensions, that she was still trapped between two places, and that this wasn't real either. But her mother's hands clutched hers, trembling. A sob broke from Marion Harper's lips, her fingers digging into Eliza's palm as if anchoring her to this world. "Eliza!" she whispered, her voice raw. Eliza turned her head toward her, the movement slow and sluggish, her body too heavy and too real. Her mother's face wasn't perfect. Her hair was grayer than before, the lines around her mouth deeper. Her expression was worn and weary. She looked like someone who had been watching their child slip away for weeks. Eliza tried to speak, but her throat was raw and useless. Marion let out another sob, a choked sob, pressing their hands together. "He came back." Eliza blinked, slowly, disoriented. There was no vine, no twilight sky, no house. There was no Sophie, no father waiting for her with open arms. The grief hit her like a fist to the ribs, cracking her open. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself feel it. Part 5. The days after waking felt unreal in a way that was different from the house beyond the vine. The world of hospital walls and quiet murmurs, of beeping machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic should have been familiar. But after spending what felt like an eternity in that other place, this reality felt alien, unnatural, and inhospitable. Eliza spent hours staring at the ceiling, feeling the heaviness of her body, the way her fingers trembled when she lifted them. She wasn't sure if it was from weakness or from something deeper, but something had fractured inside her. Of that she was certain. All the while, her mother hadn't left her bedside, not once. Marion Harper had always been a strong woman, but now there was something brittle about her, something stretched too thin. Her fingers, she ran them over Eliza's knuckles absently, as if grounding herself in the movement. "How long?" Eliza finally asked, her voice hoarse. Marion blinked, as if she'd been caught between sleep and wakefulness. She sat up straighter, gripping Eliza's hand. 17 days, her mother replied. Eliza felt a cold pulse in her stomach. "I was gone for that long?" "You were here, but you weren't," Marion said, her voice thin. "You collapsed at the funeral home. You weren't responsive. She swallowed, looking down. "The doctors said it was a dissociative episode, that sometimes grief can push people into places in their minds where they can't find their way back." Eliza licked her cracked lips. "The vine?" Her mother frowned. "What?" "In my apartment," Eliza said. It grew overnight. It broke through my ceiling and I climbed. She stopped. Even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. Marion exhaled slowly, rubbing her forehead. Sweetheart, there was no vine. A shiver ran through Eliza's spine. Then how did I... You were unconscious, her mother said, interrupting. You weren't answering my call, so I came over. You were lying on the floor in your living room, curled up like you were sleeping. I thought you were dead. Eliza's lips parted, but no words came. She had climbed the vine. She had felt the bark beneath her fingers, the wind rushing against her skin as she ascended into that other sky. She had seen her father, heard his laughter, had held Sophie in her arms. It wasn't possible that none of it had happened. Her mother squeezed her hand. The doctors gave you something to help stabilize you. They think it was stress, exhaustion. She hesitated. And the medications, they think that might have contributed. A deep unease settled into Eliza's ribs. She remembered the pills, the ones prescribed after Sophie died, the ones she had taken sporadically at best. She had hated the way they made her feel, too numb, too detached. But in the weeks leading up to her collapse, she'd started taking them again. Had they done this to her? Had she fallen into some chemical fog where grief twisted into hallucination? The thought unsettled her, but not as much as she could still feel. The memory of her father's arms around her, the weight of Sophie's head against her shoulder. Could a delusion leave a shadow that deep? Her recovery was slow. Physically, she was fine. She was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise fine. It was her mind that had to relearn how to move forward. The house in the woods still clung to the edges of her thoughts, a place that no longer existed, but still felt more real than the world she woke up to. She didn't talk about it at first. When the psychiatrist, Dr. Carter Wells, asked her what she had experienced, she found herself unable to explain it in any way that didn't make her sound lost. Instead, she gave him the version that made sense. I was somewhere else, she told him. It was a dream, I think, but it felt real. Grief can do that, he said simply, especially when it's layered, unresolved. Your mind needed an escape, so it created one. But why them, she asked, gripping the blanket draped over her legs. Why my dad, my uncle, my sister? Dr. Wells studied her for a long moment. Because they were safe. They were the people you loved most. The mind, when it's under distress, doesn't always build nightmares. Sometimes it builds comfort, a place where pain doesn't exist. Eliza exhaled, shaking her head. Then why was it so hard to leave? Because that's the thing about grief, he said. It's heavy, but in a way that becomes familiar. Losing it means moving forward, and moving forward means leaving them behind. The words made something in her chest tighten. But they weren't real, she whispered. No, he said gently. They weren't. She wanted to believe him, but some nights, as she lay awake in the hospital bed, she swore she could still smell lavender. A week later, she was discharged. Her mother drove her home, the car ride quiet but not uncomfortable. Marion didn't push her to talk. She didn't ask if Eliza wanted to stay with her for a while, though the offer lingered in the air between them, unspoken. Eliza wasn't sure if she would have said yes. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. No shattered ceiling, no creeping vines, just dust settling on the furniture, dishes left untouched in the sink, a life abandoned mid-step. She moved through the space carefully, as if something might shift beneath her feet, as if some part of that other world had followed her back, but there was nothing. There was no twilight sky beyond the window, no warm laughter curling in the air. The only thing waiting for her was silence. She let her bag down and inhaled slowly. Her mother hesitated in the doorway. "Are you going to be okay?" Eliza turned, managing a small, tired smile. "I think so." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. Marion studied her a moment longer, then nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand before stepping back. "If you need me," she said, "I'm only a call away." Eliza nodded, and then she was alone. She stood in the middle of her apartment for a long time, listening to the quiet. There was no vine, no house, no father, no uncle, no Sophie. She was here, and she was alive. She closed her eyes, grounding herself in the present. For the first time in months, she let herself miss them. Later that night, she sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She reached into her pocket, brushing her fingers against something small, something smooth. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, she pulled it out. It was a seed, black, smooth, and unmistakable. She should have thrown it away or crushed it beneath her heel. Instead, she turned it over in her palm, staring at it in the glow of the streetlights. In the back of her mind, a single thought curled, unbidden. To see what you have lost, plant this. Eliza closed her fingers around the seed. She had to know. Slowly but surely, she made her way to the corner of her apartment where she found an old ceramic pot tucked away. Methodically, she filled it with soil, and as if on autopilot, she retrieved the seed, inspected it for just a moment, and pressed it into the dirt. A familiar scent drifted through the air the moment she finished watering it. Lavender. It was impossible, she told herself. And yet there it was again. Sophie. Precious Sophie. She braced herself for what she knew would come next. The voices, the embraces, the love. Deep down inside, she knew it wasn't real, that they were imposters, and yet she craved their affection. With every fiber of her being, she craved it. When they arrived the next day, she would answer their call. And this time, she knew, before the first stalk sprouted leading to the sky, that she was never coming back. She loved her mother, too, but she needed more. More than her mother could provide, more than anyone could ever know. Silently, she mouthed an apology to the one she'd be leaving behind and returned her attention to the pot. It had been just a few minutes, but even now, she swore she saw the first signs of growth, of hope, a better future, an end to the heartache. Yes, Eliza was certain. She knew it instinctively. She'd never been so sure of anything in her life. This time, she was never coming back. This time, for once and forever. She was going home, and no one would ever, ever take that away from her again. And that was To See What You Have Lost by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights creator Craig Groshek, as performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
Otis, I don't know about you, but if a mysterious plant starts growing out of nowhere in my house, I think I'll just move.
Not a bad idea. Some things are better left buried, and some options, no matter how tempting, should never be entertained.
I couldn't agree more. My dearest listeners, thank you for spending your evening with us today. Now, I know if you've stuck it out until now, that means you love a good scare. And if that's the case, don't miss out on even more chilling content. By joining our patrons area, you'll unlock extended editions of this show, packed with extra stories and completely ad-free across our network.
It's easy to sign up. Just head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons. That'll take you to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where a whole archive of spine-tingling tales awaits. stretching back more than a decade.
For just $7.99 a month, or even less with an annual plan, you'll get double the terror while supporting the indie creators who bring these nightmares to life.
So why wait? Step into the patrons area today and let's keep the scares coming. Thanks so much, everyone, for your support. It means more than you could possibly imagine.
And my friends, if you haven't subscribed to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube yet, now's the perfect time. And don't forget to tap that bell icon so you never miss an episode.
And while you're at it, check out Nightmare Fuel, my midweek podcast, where I bring you even more sinister stories by the fire. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
And be sure to follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on social media. We're on X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as Facebook and Instagram.
If you want to chat with me directly, just look up Otis Jiry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's stories.
And let's not forget the incredible authors behind these tales. Give them some love, check out their other work, and keep the horror alive.
And with that, my friends, we've come to the conclusion of tonight's chilling collection. From haunted melodies to twisted timelines, we've wandered through fables that were never meant to be written. I'd say it's time to step back into the light, if we can still find our way back.
Indeed, Otis. But if there's one thing tonight's stories have taught us, it's that some journeys change you forever. Whether or not you can leave doesn't always mean you should.
Until next Sunday, my friends, stay safe, stay sharp, and most importantly, stay scared.
Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?